I knew the moment the envelope slid across the table that something inside me was breaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, painful snap that told me life would never return to what it was. I had spent years shrinking myself, letting others assume I had nothing, believing that silence would keep the peace. But that night, staring at a number meant to erase me, I realized the real betrayal was not the money they offered. It was the belief that I would accept it. And that moment became the beginning of everything that followed. Before today's story unfolds, take a second to say hi in the comments and tell us where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing our community grow across oceans and continents. Do not forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story full of twists, emotions, and unforgettable lessons. Now, dim the lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let us set out on this adventure together. My name is Marta Leland, and at 64, my mornings have become something like a quiet ritual of survival. The townhouse on King Street has been my shelter for more than 3 decades, a narrow brick home with a white frame porch and magnolia branches stretching toward the sidewalk like gentle, dignified arms. Charleston, South Carolina, wakes slowly each day, and I have always loved how the air carries a warm, salty breath from the harbor long before the sun fully rises. Even the gulls seem reluctant to disturb the stillness. I begin each morning the same way. I grind the coffee by hand, listening to the soft rattle of the old burr grinder, then pour water into the stained metal kettle I refuse to replace. The scent of dark roast fills the kitchen, drifting through the wooden beams like a familiar companion. I push open the front door and water the magnolia sapling I planted years ago. Its leaves are waxy and glossy, strong in a way I wish I had been at its age. The street outside is lined with similar houses, each holding its own secrets, each family performing politeness in the unmistakable Southern way. Smiles are gentle, words are courteous, but judgments linger beneath them like humidity. After caring for the plants, I slip on the cardigan I have worn for so long, it feels like an extension of my skin. I glance at the small canvas bag hanging on the chair, the one I always take to the Charleston Public Library, where I work part-time. My days there are peaceful. I shelve returns, help visitors find books, and occasionally offer recommendations to the children who dart through the aisles with an energy I no longer possess. The job is modest, but I like modest things. They allow me to move through the world unseen. It is strange how memories seep into quiet spaces. As I sit with my coffee, I often picture Jonah as a young boy, running barefoot through the narrow backyard, chasing bubbles or fireflies depending on the season. He grew into a thoughtful man, gentle and intelligent, though easily swayed by the expectations of others. When he left for college, the house felt cold for months. When he returned to Charleston years later, the warmth returned with him, even if only in passing visits. His wedding in Savannah had been beautiful in its own curated, immaculate way. Elise, his bride, stood beside him with the poise of someone raised to perform grace. I watched them exchange vows beneath the branches of an ancient oak tree, its moss trailing like silver hair. The ceremony was elegant, almost aristocratic, and though I smiled, I felt something unsettled beneath the surface. A mother always feels it before anyone else. Upstairs, tucked into the far corner of the attic, sits a heavy fireproof safe. Inside lies a secret I have carried for 5 years. $33 million held through a blind trust called Leland Harbor Investments. It came from an unexpected windfall, the kind that changes lives but can also ruin them. I built a shield of confidentiality around it, hired advisors who understand silence, and continued living as though nothing at all had shifted in my world. I never told Jonah. I needed to know how people loved him. I needed to see who remained when they believed we had nothing. Wealth, when visible, distorts every human relation, but when hidden, it becomes a compass. It points to loyalty, motives, and truth. As I finish my morning coffee, sunlight stretches across the kitchen table, warming the wood. I sense something drifting toward me, like a storm forming far offshore. My life has been calm for years, deliberately quiet, but quiet moments often precede the most violent changes. And though I do not yet know it, the peace I cling to is already beginning to crack. If you're still watching, and this moment hits you harder than you expected, comment number 1 below so I know you're right here with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Things are about to shift in a way no one sees coming. 3 days after Jonah and Elisa's wedding, the quiet inside my townhouse felt unusually fragile, as if a single sound could fracture it. The midday sunlight drifted across the floor in thin, warm strips, and I stood in the kitchen warming water for tea. The house was peaceful in that familiar Charleston way, where even the walls seemed to breathe slowly. I just reached for the tin of loose leaves when a firm knocking echoed through the hallway. It was not hurried or panicked. It was deliberate, the kind of knock given by someone who had made a decision long before lifting their hand. I froze for a moment, my fingers resting on the kettle handle. Instinct told me the visitor was not a neighbor. Neighbors in this part of King Street knocked lightly, almost apologetically. This sound carried a weight I could not name, and it moved through the house like a disruption of air. I walked slowly toward the door, noticing how the hallway seemed dimmer than usual, perhaps only because my mind had already shifted into caution. Before turning the knob, I looked through the narrow window beside the door. Elise Hammond stood on the porch, her posture perfectly upright, her hands clasped together as if holding herself in place. Her clothes were pressed to perfection, and her hair was tied back in a way that made her look older than her 20-something years. Next to her stood a young man in a charcoal suit, his leather briefcase held tightly against his side. He did not look around or take in the house. He stared straight ahead, the kind of stare that belonged to people who felt they were carrying authority. I opened the door only halfway, keeping the frame between us like a quiet boundary. Elise attempted a small smile that flickered and disappeared. The lawyer simply nodded, waiting for her to speak. I could see the faint tremble in her fingers and the stiffness in her smile, signs that she was not entirely comfortable with being here. The lawyer, on the other hand, looked as though he had rehearsed every breath he took. The hallway behind me was cool and faintly scented with old wood and magnolia leaves. It always made visitors lower their voices, but these two did not seem to notice the atmosphere. Their presence felt like the first curl of smoke from a distant fire. Elise finally spoke, her voice soft and overly careful. She said they needed to clarify some financial expectations now that Jonah was married. Her words felt as though they had been handed to her rather than chosen. I stepped aside and let them in, watching the way their eyes shifted as they entered the living room. The lawyer carried himself with a rigidity that suggested efficiency, not warmth. He explained that they needed information regarding my income, savings, and long-term support capability. The phrases fell into the room like cold stones. Elise stood slightly behind him, clearly wishing he would speak more gently, yet unable to stop him. Inside, my thoughts stayed steady. Their visit did not surprise me. People reveal themselves more quickly when they believe they are speaking to someone with nothing to offer. I listened without interrupting, allowing them to speak their rehearsed lines. The more they talked, the clearer their intentions became. They wanted to measure me, assess me, categorize me before I had even poured them tea. I said very little. Silence was my shield, and they walked straight into it. As they finished outlining their requests, a certainty settled inside me. This was not a meeting, it was an opening move. A storm had begun with a gentle knock, and I knew the air in my house would never feel the same again. If you're still watching and you can already sense something deeper brewing beneath the surface, comment number 2 to let me know you're following closely. Because chapter 3 is where the real fracture begins. The evening air along Charleston Harbor carried a faint trace of salt as I stepped out of the rideshare and looked up at the rooftop terrace where the Hammond family had arranged the dinner. The light strung across the open-air lounge glimmered like a net of gold, and the soft jazz floating from above made the entire place feel curated, intentional, and in its own way, intimidating. I tightened the thin cardigan around my shoulders, aware of how plain it looked compared to the polished glow that always seemed to surround the Hammonds. Jonah walked beside me with the restless energy of someone bracing for impact, while Elise lingered a few steps ahead, glancing between us as if trying to hold two worlds together with nothing but the twitch of her worried smile. When we were led to the long table facing the water, Miranda Hammond rose gracefully, radiating the kind of confidence that stated she believed her family owned the entire view. She greeted us with warmth, shaped like a blade, polite but assessing. I saw her eyes sweep from my shoes to my cardigan, then up to my hair, as if she were mentally cataloging my worth. She spoke about the beautiful weather, the excellent wine list, and a renovation project she was overseeing. All of it delivered with the underlying assumption that I lived in a universe far smaller and poorer than hers. Douglas Hammond chimed in occasionally, adding comments about financial planning and long-term commitments, never directly accusing, yet clearly implying that my life experience fell short of whatever standards their family valued. The food arrived in delicate plates I barely recognized. Elise kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Jonah tapped his thumb against the edge of his water glass, a familiar sign of discomfort. I listened more than I spoke. Listening always revealed more. The longer the dinner went on, the more apparent it became that the Hammonds had not invited me here to welcome me. They had invited me to study me. Near the end of the meal, Miranda reached into her structured handbag and pulled out a thin white envelope. She placed it gently near my plate with a smile too polished to be sincere. Her tone carried the softness of someone offering a gift, but the undercurrent was unmistakably transactional. Douglas nodded with quiet approval, as though the gesture were something negotiated long before this night. I looked at the envelope for a long moment, then placed my fingertips on it without opening it. The contents were less important than the intentions. They wanted to lighten the burden I could place on Jonah and Elise. They wanted to define my role as someone who needed to be managed. A wave of heat rose to my face, not from anger, but from recognition. This was the moment I had been preparing for without fully admitting it to myself. As I returned the envelope to the center of the table, I felt every eye watching, waiting for embarrassment or gratitude. Instead, I kept my voice steady, offering a simple acknowledgement without emotion. I knew then what the Hammonds believed about me. I also knew how wrong they were. By the time we stepped back into the night air, the harbor breeze felt sharper. The dinner had changed things, not in a dramatic or explosive way, but in a quiet shift, the kind that settles deep into the bones. It was the first real sign that the storm ahead would not be small, and that I needed to prepare for what was coming. If you're still watching and the tension is starting to get under your skin, comment number 3 so I know you're feeling it too. Now, stay with me. Chapter 4 takes the pressure to a whole new level. When I returned home that night, the quiet inside my small Charleston apartment felt heavier than usual. The walls seemed to hold the remnants of the dinner conversation, as if the echoes of the Hammond family's undertones had followed me through the door. I set my purse on the counter, but did not bother turning on the television or distracting myself. I needed the silence. I needed to replay every detail of that evening, each glance and calculated pause, every politely wrapped insult. I had known arrogance before, but the Hammond version of it carried the precision of something inherited, polished by generations of entitlement. My phone rang shortly after I sat down. Jonah's voice came through uneven, torn between shame and anger. He apologized for not anticipating what his in-laws would attempt, and I could hear the frustration tightening his breath each time he paused. I reassured him, without adding fuel to the fire. Jonah had always been the emotional one, quick to defend, but just as quick to act without considering the fallout. Elise remained silent on the line, her presence more of a question mark than comfort. When the call ended, the silence returned, but this time it carried a sharper edge. The next morning, Jonah and Elise arrived at my door. Jonah stepped in with the determination of someone ready to fight, while Elise hesitated at the threshold as if bracing for judgment. Her face held tension layered with guilt, and I understood her better in that moment than I had the night before. She lived suspended between two worlds, one built on privilege and one built on love, and neither seemed willing to make space for the other. Jonah insisted on confronting her parents immediately. He wanted to demand respect, to draw a hard line. I stopped him. I told him that reacting now would only strengthen the Hammond family's belief that they could shape the situation to their benefit. Moving too soon would turn the battle into noise instead of strategy. Elise listened closely, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with fear. She admitted that she worried about her parents cutting her off financially. She did not defend their behavior, but she acknowledged the reality of her dependence. The honesty in her tone softened my frustration. She was not malicious. She was conditioned. As we talked, Elise unintentionally revealed something that shifted the ground beneath us. Her mother had already hired a private legal advisor to investigate my financial capacity. The envelope at dinner had only been the first step. The Hammonds wanted leverage, and they were building it quietly. The information struck me not as a threat, but as confirmation. They were not retreating. They were preparing. That night, after they left, I pulled out the files belonging to Appalachian Ridge Holdings. Every document, every statement, every protective layer I had built years ago remained intact. I reviewed them carefully, not out of fear, but as a reminder of the distance between what the Hammond family believed and what was real. I knew Jonah felt shaken by the idea of them digging into my life. He encouraged drastic honesty, but I told him the truth had its own timing. Revealing power too early only gave the other side room to adjust. When the apartment grew quiet again, I sat by the window and watched the harbor in the distance. The masts of the boats were barely visible in the dim light, but they swayed with the same rhythm they always had. The calm before a storm does not announce itself with thunder. It announces itself with stillness. I understood now that the Hammond family had made their first move. Mine would come later, and when it did, it would not be subtle. If you're still watching and the frustration is building inside you, comment number 4 to let me know you're still here. Because what comes next will shake the entire foundation of this story. The air inside Jonah and Elise's home felt tight the moment I walked in. Days of quiet strain had settled over their living room like a thin layer of frost. The lights were dim, although it was still early in the evening, and the house had the kind of silence that signaled people were avoiding the conversations that needed to happen. Jonah sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, while Elise stood near the window, arms folded as if holding herself together. I knew then that whatever tonight brought, it would not be gentle. I had come because Jonah insisted we talk about how to face the Hammond family moving forward. Before any of us could begin, a sudden knock cut through the room. I felt both Jonah and Elise tense instantly. I already knew who it was before the door opened. Miranda and Douglas stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, moving with the assuredness of people who believed their presence was not only expected but necessary. Elise let out a small breath of shock, while Jonah rose sharply, shoulders squared. I stayed still, watching. Miranda offered a composed smile, though her eyes gleamed with something colder. She announced that they wanted a final conversation regarding the tension in the family. The tone suggested she believed herself to be the one extending grace. She spoke about marital stability, long-term planning, and the importance of keeping outside influences from disrupting the harmony of a young couple. Her meaning was clear enough for a child to understand. Elise turned pale, unable to stop her mother but too ashamed to look at me. Douglas joined in, speaking with the deliberate slowness of a man explaining obvious things to someone he considered beneath him. He said I had become a source of division. He said my opinions and my presence were pulling Jonah away from their guidance. He framed every accusation as a concern. His words had the smoothness of practiced authority, and yet they carried the unmistakable weight of control. Then came the moment that shifted the entire room. Miranda revealed that she and her husband had already consulted a lawyer. They claimed they were exploring options to ensure a healthy boundary, a phrase that served as the polite mask for their true intention, legally pushing me out of my own son's life. They said it with the confidence of people convinced they were doing what was right, not only for their daughter, but for the image they curated so carefully. The reaction inside Jonah was immediate and fierce. I watched the anger rise in him like a flame catching wind. It was a rare thing to see him lose composure, but tonight his voice wavered with betrayal and disbelief. He defended me with raw emotion, and for a moment I feared he would say something he could not take back. Elise stood helpless in the middle of the storm, shock overtaking her hesitation. I placed a hand lightly on Jonah's arm and told him to step back. My voice was quiet, but the stillness of it cut through the rising chaos. When I finally faced Miranda and Douglas, I felt the shift within myself, the one I had been suppressing for years. I spoke calmly, without raising my tone, and told them what they had refused to see. I told them they had judged me by appearances, by assumptions, by the narrow lens of their own status. I told them they had never asked who I was, only what I lacked. As the words left my mouth, Miranda's expression faltered. Douglas looked as if he had been pushed off balance. Elise pressed a hand over her lips, horror dawning on her as she realized just how far her parents had gone. I did not shout. I did not curse. I simply told the truth, and it struck harder than anger ever could. I ended by making one thing clear. They had crossed a line they had no right to cross. The room fell silent, a silence so sharp it felt carved into the air itself. We all stood suspended in it, knowing nothing about the situation would ever return to what it had been. The living room felt as though it had not taken a single breath since the confrontation ended. The air remained thick, unmoving, as if the walls themselves were still processing everything that had been said. I stood near the end of the coffee table, my pulse steady despite the storm that had just passed. Jonah hovered a few feet away, shifting his weight as though he no longer recognized the space around him. Elise leaned against the wall with her hands pressed together tightly, her eyes glossy and unfocused. Miranda and Douglas attempted to regain their composure, but the false calm clung to them like cracked porcelain. Jonah looked at me first, then at his in-laws, and I could see the truth settling inside him in real time. The pieces he had refused to examine were finally arranging themselves into a clear picture. His marriage had been under someone else's supervision, guided by expectations that had nothing to do with him. The realization carried a heaviness I had hoped he would never need to feel. A son should never have to choose between loyalty and independence, but here he was, standing right at that crossroads. Elise trembled with her own conflict. She pressed her fingers to her lips as if afraid the wrong sound might break her entirely. She had been raised to obey without questioning, and now obedience had become a trap with the walls closing in from both sides. She feared losing her parents, yet she feared losing Jonah even more. I could see the toll of that internal battle wearing her down, tearing through layers she had spent a lifetime constructing. Miranda spoke first, her voice thinner than before, stripped of its elegant certainty. She claimed everything she had done came from love for her daughter, from the desire to protect Elise from stress and instability. She said this as though chipping away at Jonah's mother was a safety measure, not manipulation. Her tone lacked its usual grace, revealing desperation she could not hide. Douglas moved closer, adding that they believed a temporary reduction in contact with me would benefit the marriage. It was presented as a practical suggestion, but the implication hovered heavily in the room. Their version of resolving tension required removing me from Jonah's life. Something icy ran down my spine, not from fear, but from recognition. This was not concern. This was a demand disguised as compromise, a choice disguised as support. And as Douglas continued, the earlier admission they had made resurfaced in my mind, the one about speaking to an attorney. I asked him to repeat that intention. Before he could answer, Miranda accidentally revealed more than she meant to. She mentioned they had considered a structured financial agreement for Jonah, something that would tie his future to theirs so tightly that he would have no room to deviate. In that moment, Jonah's expression shifted into something wounded and fierce. He realized just how deep their plans reached. I weighed my next steps carefully. I knew I could end everything right there by revealing the truth about Appalachian Ridge Holdings. But disclosure was not a weapon. It was timing. Timing determined impact. Timing determined whether truth liberated or simply startled. And tonight was not the moment for that revelation. Jonah inhaled deeply, steadying himself before speaking. His decision rose from inside him with unmistakable clarity. He stated that he would no longer allow anyone to dictate the direction of his life, not the Hammond family, not their expectations, not their influence. He affirmed that Elise was his partner, but I was his mother, and both roles held value that should not be ranked or controlled. His words were not loud, but their firmness carried through the entire room. Elise began to cry softly. The emotional dam she had held back finally broke. She confessed she wanted to build her own family, free from the invisible reins her parents had always held. She knew choosing Jonah meant stepping out of their shadow, and for the first time, she accepted that path with intention rather than fear. Miranda's pride cracked, and Douglas's authority dimmed. Realizing they had lost control, they left without further argument, closing the door behind them with a silence far colder than anger. Jonah wrapped his arms around me, and Elise stood beside him, but none of us mistook this for resolution. It was only a pause, the breath held before the next inevitable collision. I looked at both of them and understood fully. The real battle had just begun. If you're still watching, and the intensity of that turning point left you breathless, drop a number 6 in the comments so I know you felt it charmed it. Now take a deep breath. Chapter 7 starts unraveling everything. The moment the door closed behind Miranda and Douglas, the house fell into a silence so heavy it felt almost physical. It pressed against the walls, against the furniture, against our chests. Jonah remained standing in the center of the living room, shoulders tense, eyes unfocused. His breath came in uneven pulls, as if his body still had not decided whether to react with anger or collapse. Elise lowered herself into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as they gripped the fabric of her skirt. I could feel the echo of the confrontation lingering like a vibration in the air, the kind that stays long after voices have stopped. I felt exhaustion creep into my bones, not the kind that comes from age, but the kind born from emotional impact. Yet beneath that fatigue was a strange clarity. The confrontation had been painful, but it had stripped away illusions. The Hammond family had shown their hand fully, without restraint. The path ahead would not be peaceful, but at least it was now visible. I knew then that the luxury of staying quiet had expired. Jonah turned toward me slowly, the guilt already forming in his expression. He looked like a man who had been spun too many times and was still trying to find his balance. He blamed himself for not seeing the manipulation earlier, for letting his marriage drift under someone else's control, for allowing his wife to bear the weight of two loyalties. His voice cracked when he asked whether he had only made things worse. The uncertainty in his eyes tugged at the part of me that had raised him through storms far worse than this. I told him gently that truth always comes with a cost, and that tonight was simply the beginning of that cost being paid. There was no shame in recognizing a trap only after stepping into it. What mattered was the decision he had made to stop walking blindly. My calm seemed to steady him, if only a little. It reminded him he still had choices. Elise, however, had sunk into herself. Her eyes were red, her posture collapsed, as if someone had turned out the lights inside her. She whispered that she did not understand how her parents could call their actions love when those actions were shaped entirely by control. She admitted, with a kind of stunned heartbreak, that most of her life had been curated by their expectations, not her own desires. The tears that fell now were not from embarrassment, but from a deeper grief, the grief of seeing a childhood rewritten under a harsher light. Jonah knelt beside her and took her hand, and for the first time since their wedding, I saw them stand on the same side of something. It was a small but meaningful unity, the beginning of them choosing each other rather than defaulting to their separate worlds. Watching them, I felt a fragile sense of hope threading its way through the chaos, though the uncertainty of the future still hovered like a dark cloud. Then came the turn none of us expected. Elise checked her phone and froze. Her face drained of color as she scrolled through a stream of messages from her mother. The words were sharp, filled with accusations about betrayal, warnings about the consequences of choosing wrong, and threats to withdraw financial support for housing, bills, and even routine expenses. Elise's breath hitched as she realized these were not empty threats. The life she had lived, the comfort she had known, could vanish with the snap of her parents' fingers. I watched her panic rise, and something inside me shifted. I remembered the years after my husband died, when survival depended on discipline, not comfort. Elise had never been taught resilience. Cutting her off now would break her spirit, not build her strength. This was not the battlefield where she needed to stand alone. I sat beside her and spoke softly, telling her that new lives often begin where old safety nets end. I suggested that she and Jonah pause all contact with her parents, at least long enough to find stable emotional ground. I promised her that in time she would discover her own strength, even if she could not yet see where it came from. When I stepped outside into the night, the air wrapped around me in a mix of coolness and heaviness. The sky was dark, but not empty. I knew the Hammond family would not retreat. Their pride would not allow it. The road ahead would be difficult, unpredictable, charged with agendas and consequences. But as I walked to my car, I understood something with a calm certainty. For the first time since this began, I was not fighting this war alone. When I returned to my apartment that night, the quiet wrapped around me like an old, familiar coat. The space felt unchanged, yet something inside me had shifted sharply. I set my keys on the counter and sat at the kitchen table, letting the stillness settle long enough for my thoughts to untangle. The events of the past hours replayed in the steady sequence. Every accusation, every tremble in Elise's voice, every flare of anger in Jonah's eyes. The Hammond family had made their intentions unmistakably clear. They would not retreat. They would escalate. I took a deep breath and forced myself to evaluate everything calmly. Jonah and Elise had finally stood on the same side, which was progress, but they were fragile. Their unity was new, raw, and still vulnerable to pressure from a family that had spent years shaping Elise's entire world. Neither of them had the financial independence or the emotional foundation to withstand a prolonged assault from Miranda and Douglas. If I was going to help them, I could not rely on emotion. I needed strategy. The weight of the insults still stung, even if I refused to dwell on them. It had been years since anyone tried to belittle me so openly. The memories of the years after my husband's death rose quietly, years when survival depended on discipline, not dignity. I had endured more than what the Hammond family could comprehend. Remembering those difficult days reminded me of my own resilience. Their cruelty could not compete with what life had already forced me to conquer. I pulled a notepad toward me and wrote down everything they had done so far: the envelope, the lawyer, the threats directed at Elise. Looking at the list, I felt a slow but steady shift inside my chest. Their actions were not evidence of power. They were evidence of panic. People confident in their influence did not need lawyers or threats. People uncertain of their control did. That realization became the first step of my plan. I opened my laptop and accessed the secure documents for Appalachian Ridge Holdings. The structure remained intact, the layers of private ownership still hidden behind legal protections. I sent a cautious email to an old financial advisor asking for a review of every shield and firewall. My communication gave away nothing personal. My identity within the company remained just as invisible as I had designed it to be years ago. Next, I considered Jonah and Elise's practical needs. If Miranda followed through on her threats, they could lose their housing support and daily expenses overnight. I wanted them to learn independence, but I did not want them destroyed in the process. Their financial safety net needed a quiet backup plan, one that would not reveal the truth before I was ready. When I checked my messages, I noticed an email Elise had forwarded earlier. Buried near the bottom was a line that made my stomach tighten. Miranda had made an inquiry into my credit information. It was subtle but clear. She had crossed another boundary. She believed she could uncover something damaging, never suspecting that the truth she would eventually find would dismantle her entire strategy. Instead of fear, I felt certainty. Her arrogance was her weakness. I stood and looked at myself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back was no longer hiding behind humility. Silence had served its purpose. Now it needed to transform into something sharper. The moment to reveal everything had not arrived yet, but it was approaching. I turned off the lights and let the darkness settle around me. The battle ahead was mine to direct now, and for the first time, I felt ready to lead it. If you're still watching and the weight of these revelations hit you right in the chest, comment number 8 to show you're still with me. Now get ready. What comes next is the ending that changes everything. When the legal dust finally settled, I found myself walking through the quiet hallways of my home with a sense of stillness I had not felt in years. The documents had been signed, the court hearings completed, and the lawyers who once swarmed around my life had disappeared into the background. What remained was a strange and almost unfamiliar calm. I had grown so accustomed to bracing for the next blow that I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without tension sitting on my shoulders. The truth about my savings and the truth about who had tried to exploit me had made its way into the light in ways I could never have predicted. Some people would have called it revenge. To me, it felt more like restoration. A restoration of dignity, of boundaries, of self-respect that had been worn thin by years of silence and by the subtle pressure to remain small for other people's comfort. I had once thought that blending into the background would protect my son from judgment, but hiding had only taught others they could shape the narrative about me without consequence. Word reached our neighborhood faster than I expected. Some neighbors looked at me differently, not with envy, but with a kind of startled respect. Others apologized quietly for their assumptions. I accepted their apologies with a steady nod and moved on. My life was not built for theatrics. It was built for resilience. Andrew visited me often, still processing the whirlwind that had twisted his marriage and his view of his wife's family. He carried guilt, but I never let it linger. Growth requires truth, and he had finally stepped into his own truth with strength I had always known he had. He no longer walked into my home with the weight of unspoken worries. Instead, he brought a gentler presence, one that felt closer to the boy I had raised. Sophie came too, each time more certain of her own voice. She was changing, shedding the layers of expectation her mother had woven into her. She did not ask for permission anymore. She simply stood as herself. As for me, I returned to my work at the community center, the same place that grounded me before any of the chaos began. I found comfort in routine. I found peace in anonymity. And I found strength in knowing that my silence had ended exactly when it needed to. The truth had been a long time coming. And now, standing on the other side of it, I finally understood something simple and steady. Sometimes survival is quiet, but freedom is loud. In the quiet that followed the turmoil, I found myself returning to familiar routines with a new sense of purpose. There was no dramatic celebration, no sudden shift in lifestyle, no need for grand gestures to mark the end of everything that had happened. Instead, the lesson revealed itself slowly, like morning light spreading across a room. I had spent years believing that silence was protection, that modesty was safety, and that shrinking myself would somehow shield my son from judgment. But the truth had shown me something different. Silence, when used too long, does not protect. It erases. It invites assumptions. It invites the wrong people to step into the space you leave empty and define you for their own comfort. I understood now that strength is not measured by how well one endures disrespect, but by how firmly one stands when dignity is threatened. I had always thought of myself as steady, composed, patient. I never imagined those traits could be mistaken for weakness by people who had never learned the difference between humility and submission. Yet the lesson was not only for them, it was for me too. Andrew learned something as well. He saw how easily love can be clouded by obligation and how important it is to draw boundaries even when it hurts. He discovered that protecting someone does not always mean shielding them from the truth, but sometimes allowing the truth to reshape the bond between you. I watched him grow into a man who spoke with clarity and moved with intention. That was worth more to me than any inheritance, any legacy, any victory. Sophie learned that loyalty cannot be built on fear. She realized that control disguised as love is not love at all, and that breaking away from unhealthy expectations is the first step toward building a life of her own. As for me, I learned that wealth does not define freedom. Truth does. And when truth arrives, it does not always bring peace immediately, but it always brings direction. In the end, the lesson was simple. Dignity is the one inheritance worth fighting for, and I finally chose to claim mine. In the quiet, after every storm, there comes a moment when the heart finally exhales, and the truth stands steady in the clearing. Sometimes it arrives gently, sometimes it arrives like a reckoning, but it always illuminates the same lesson. Dignity is the one possession no one can take unless we hand it away. Life has a way of testing the boundaries we draw around our worth, reminding us that silence is not always kindness, and endurance is not the same as surrender. Strength grows in the spaces where honesty meets courage, and peace follows when we choose ourselves without apology. If this story touched you, lingered with you, or reminded you of your own strength, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please share your reflections in the comments, follow for more stories, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Your presence here truly means a lot.